Um, Imagine looking down into a village. Well, right. You know it has been entirely dry for decades. You're expecting to just see cracked stone.
Yeah, just dirt and darkness at the bottom,
Exactly. But instead you see this black water, and beneath the surface of that water, you see the reflection of a city that doesn't even exist.
which is terrifying on its own.
Right. But it gets worse because
Yeah.
you see someone you love down there, someone who, died years ago, and they are just standing waist deep in that submerged city. And they're smiling up at you with completely empty eye sockets.
Wow. Yeah, that's a visceral image.
It is. Or, I mean, consider this other scenario from our stack of sources today. Imagine walking through a modern, bustling city center. Mid-stride, the deafening noise of the traffic and the crowds, it all just stops.
Like total silence.
Yes. Everyone around you is suddenly frozen in time. They are physically motionless, just paralyzed. But you realize with this sinking dread that they are still completely conscious.
Right. Their awareness hasn't stopped.
Exactly. And slowly, simultaneously, thousands of unblinking eyes shift to stare directly at you, while something massive and unseen begins to manifest right behind your back.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and it actually forces your body to turn around against your own will.
Both of those scenarios perfectly encapsulate the absolute violation of the physical laws we rely on to feel safe.
Totally.
Because we spend our lives trusting our environment, right?
Mm.
We trust that water reflects our sky. We trust that gravity pulls downward. And we definitely trust that we have command over our own bodies.
Yeah, personal autonomy is like the baseline of human existence.
Exactly. So when an apex predator figures out how to weaponize the very environment we live in, when it turns the architecture of our reality into a hunting ground, that is when we move from simple survival horror into this profound existential dread.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking in this deep dive today, custom tailored just for you. Today, we are exploring the mechanics of environmental predation and really the terrifying loss of personal autonomy.
That's a heavy topic.
It is, yeah. We are doing this by looking at two incredibly gripping source narratives that share this horrifying common denominator.
Right, the well in the city.
Yeah, so the primary narrative is titled The Drowned Reality Beneath the Well. It details a sealed village well that acts as an interdimensional trap, using the mimicked voices of dead loved ones as bait.
Such a cruel mechanic.
It really is. And our second narrative acts as a modern comparative study detailing that frozen city we just mentioned, where time and motion are halted to just isolate a single protagonist.
Right.
So in both cases, the mission of our deep dive is to understand the how and the why. Like, how does a localized threat escalate into a reality-altering event? And why do these entities target our emotional vulnerabilities rather than just, using physical force?
Well, I think it requires a complete paradigm shift in how we view predation. Because if you think about a traditional trap, it relies on a physical mechanism.
Like a snare.
Yeah, a tripwire, a snare, a pitfall. You have to physically blunder into it. But the entities described in these narratives, they do not hunt for your physical mass first. They hunt your psychology.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, they construct environments that strip away your free will so smoothly that by the time you realize you are trapped, your mind has actually already been assimilated.
Wow.
So we really have to dissect the anatomy of these traps, starting with the rules that govern them before the trap even springs.
Okay, so let's look at the architecture of the well in our first source. Because before any chaos breaks out, the stage is set with a very rigid set of generational rules.
The village lore, right?
Yeah. The text notes that this well, which is sitting just behind a rural village, it drowns people who fall into it, but they drown without any water present.
Right, a dry drowning.
Exactly. And every single body that the villagers ever managed to recover from the bottom came back completely missing their eyes.
Yeah, and we need to analyze the specific pathology of that detail right away.
Yeah.
Because it instantly tells us we are dealing with a surgical, intelligent force.
Not just a geological hazard or a sinkhole.
Exactly. In a natural environment, if you fall down a dry well, you succumb to impact trauma or dehydration. The fact that the victims are drowning in the absence of liquid implies a localized distortion of physics.
So it's forcing their lungs to react to water that isn't there.
Yes. The entity is forcing the victim's lungs to process an environment that isn't physically present in our dimension.
Okay, but why the eyes? I mean, from a purely horror perspective, it's a visceral, gruesome image, sure. But functionally, what does removing the eyes actually accomplish for a predator?
Well, think about the evolutionary function of human vision. Our eyes are our primary interface for verifying reality.
Right.
They process light, gauge distance, they identify threats. So by systematically removing the eyes of the victims it rejects or kills, this entity is initiating a theft of perception.
A theft of perception. I like that phrasing.
Yeah, it is blinding the prey to the true nature of the dimension they have fallen into. It's essentially a statement of absolute dominance. It's saying, you are not allowed to see the mechanics of the stomach digesting you.
Oh, man, that is grim. And that plays right into the generational trauma of the village. The elders have codified this terror into strict survival rules.
Right, the curfews.
Yeah, nobody goes near the well after sunset. They claim the well is older than the village, older than the surrounding forest, even older than human memory itself.
Which forces us to ask a highly uncomfortable question about human settlement patterns.
What do you mean?
Well, if a geographical feature is known to systematically mutilate and consume human beings, the logical human response is abandonment. You migrate.
Right, you pack up and leave.
Yeah, you put 100 miles between your children and the threat. The fact that this village was built directly adjacent to a structure older than memory suggests a kind of psychic gravity.
Wait, I want to push back on that idea of psychic gravity for a second. Are you saying the villagers are just mindless moths drawn to a flame?
Not necessarily mindless, but...
Because humans are incredibly pragmatic when it comes to survival.
Yeah.
If there is a lion den, we do not build our huts on top of it unless there is some massive resource we desperately need.
That is precisely the point. But you have to look at the resource from the predator's perspective, not the prey's.
Okay.
It's highly probable that human settlements don't just happen to cluster around this well. The entity allows the village to exist, or even subtly cultivates it.
Like a farm.
Exactly. It is practicing a form of symbiotic farming. The village isn't just a habitat, it is a pasture. This organism needs a continuous, renewable supply of human grief, memories, and biology to sustain itself.
Because if it just ate everyone, the food's gone.
Right. If it consumed everyone at once, its food source would completely deplete. So it enforces rules. It takes just enough to instill terror, ensuring the rest stay, reproduce, and generate more of that emotional resonance.
Wow. A farm where the livestock manages itself through fear? That is incredibly bleak, but I guess it makes sense when you look at the primary lure the well uses.
The voices.
Yeah, the source material describes how, at night, the well whispers the names of the living, but the hook is that it never copies the voices of strangers. It only mimics the dead.
Right.
The narrator's grandmother had a specific rule, which was, if the well speaks in a loved one's voice, run.
Let's unpack the neurological warfare happening there, because this is vastly superior to any physical bait.
How so?
Well, if you hear a stranger's voice in a dark forest, your amygdala spikes. Your brain registers a potential threat and your fight or flight response activates immediately. You retreat.
Sure, stranger danger.
Yeah. But when you hear the voice of a deceased loved one, a child, a spouse, the neurological reaction completely bypasses the fear center.
Right, it hits the emotional memory centers instead. It triggers a profound deficit.
Precisely. It triggers a deficit that the human brain is desperate to resolve. Grief is fundamentally the brain's inability to reconcile the permanent absence of a deeply mapped neural connection.
Yeah.
So by projecting the voice of the dead, the entity offers an impossible resolution to that grief. It overrides rational survival instincts with overwhelming emotional yearning. It isn't hunting for curiosity. It is hunting for the specific vulnerability of a broken heart.
I instantly think of the anglerfish, in the midnight zone of the ocean.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Yeah, it uses a bioluminescent lure to draw in smaller fish who think they're finding a meal in the pitch black. But an anglerfish is almost passive. It just dangles the light and waits.
Right.
What this entity is doing is aggressively proactive. Imagine if that glowing lure wasn't just light, but a projection of the specific thing the prey needed most to feel whole again. It's an anglerfish that weaponizes empathy.
The empathy angle is crucial because empathy is a pro-social survival trait for human beings. We survive by caring for our pack.
Exactly.
So the entity turns our most advantageous evolutionary trait into a fatal flaw. And actually, we see this exact same mechanic of weaponized isolation in the second source you mentioned.
The frozen city narrative.
Yes, the city frozen in time.
Let's bring that in. Because in the city narrative, the environment doesn't use the voices of the dead, right? But it uses the living population against the protagonist. The entire bustling city freezes, isolating the narrator entirely.
Right. In both cases, the environment actively manipulates the concept of community to create an inescapable trap.
Yeah.
In the village, the well uses the absence of loved ones as a lure. But in the city, the entity uses the presence of the community, freezing them in place and turning their conscious, unblinking gazes onto the protagonist.
It's an inversion of the same tactic.
Exactly. Stripping away the safety of the herd. The city protagonist is surrounded by thousands of people, yet has never been more profoundly alone because the herd has been compromised and turned into an audience for the predator.
It's the ultimate isolation. You are either drawn away from the safety of the village by a ghost, or the safety of the city is violently stripped away from you while you stand completely still.
Yeah, you're trapped either way.
But let's look at how a trap like this actually springs. Because a trap is essentially dormant potential energy until a specific catalyst occurs. And in the village narrative, that catalyst is the breach.
The disappearance.
Right. It happens this summer. The narrator's cousin, Ravi, vanishes.
And we really have to pay attention to the environmental manipulation that precedes the disappearance. Ravi doesn't just wander off in broad daylight.
No.
He vanishes during a sudden power outage.
Right. 1 second, he is inside his home, safe with his family, and the moment the artificial light dies, he's just gone.
Taken in the dark.
Yeah, and the village searches all night with lanterns, finding absolutely nothing, until 3 a.m. when someone hears a sound coming from the sealed well.
The orchestration of that power outage demonstrates the entity's ability to manipulate infrastructure.
It's smart.
Very. It removes the artificial barrier of electricity, plunging the village back into the Dark Ages, which is its preferred hunting condition.
Oh.
But it's the auditory design of the lure following the disappearance that is truly masterful.
The knocking. The text makes a point to emphasize that the sound isn't an echo of a boy falling. It is 3 slow knocks against the heavy stone of the well. Boom, boom, boom.
Consider the psychology of pattern recognition there. If a human being falls down a dark shaft, what is the acoustic reality of that event?
Well, it's chaos. It's thrashing, rapid pounding, panic screaming. It's totally erratic.
Exactly. Chaos is organic.
Right.
But a measured, deliberate rhythm, 1, 2, 3, pause, that implies observation.
Right.
It implies patience. It implies a mind. The entity is knocking on the barrier between worlds, asserting its sentience to the collective village standing about.
That's so creepy.
And it is creating a jarring acoustic contrast with what happens next, which is the use of Ravi's voice.
Because Ravi's father runs to the stone, completely desperate, screaming down into the dark, and from deep below the earth, Ravi's voice answers. He just says, "Dad."
Yeah.
But the narrative describes the voice as weak, cold, and sounding impossibly far away.
Which is the dual role manipulation. The entity uses the heavy, rhythmic knocking to establish dominance and draw the crowd, but it perfectly modulates the mimicked voice to sound fragile and terrified.
To target the dad.
Exactly, to manipulate the primary target. It knows that the father's protective instinct will completely override the terror of the knocking.
And the physical barrier is significant here, too. The well isn't just an open hole. It has been sealed for decades with heavy stone and thick iron chains. There is no physical way for a boy to have fallen in.
Right, it's impossible.
But Ravi's father doesn't care about the physics. He grabs a heavy iron bar and starts desperately smashing at the chains, sobbing uncontrollably. The village elders are physically trying to pull him back, screaming the old rules, begging him to stop.
But he doesn't.
No. And the source text drops a line here that essentially defines the entire narrative. It says, "Grief is louder than fear."
That single sentence is the thesis for how the biological trap operates. Because the elders represent institutional knowledge. They represent the cortex of the village, the logical, calculating survival mechanism that says, do not open the door to the predator.
Right, keep the chains on.
But the father's grief is pure, raw, brainstem instinct. The entity designed a containment vessel that it could not physically open from the inside.
Oh, wow.
It required a victim to willingly break the seal from the outside, driven by a despair so absolute that it just drowns out decades of cultural conditioning.
It's horrifying because you can't even blame the father. Any parent in that situation, hearing their child sounding cold and afraid in the dark, would tear those chains apart with their bare hands.
Absolutely.
The entity relies on our fundamental goodness, our love for our children, to trigger the apocalypse. And the moment those chains snap, the paradigm of the story violently shifts.
The localized containment fails, and the environmental breach begins instantly.
Yeah, the very first thing that happens when the chains break is a complete suppression of light. The text says every lantern and flashlight in the village dies simultaneously. Absolute darkness swallows the space.
Setting the stage.
Then comes a profound shift in the atmosphere. The smell of rotting water, wet earth, and something ancient floods the air. The heavy stone covering the well begins to grind open under its own power.
And then they see the water.
Yeah, inside the well, there is suddenly water, but it's described as black water.
Let's analyze the properties of this water because it is the primary vector for the entity's expansion. In our physical reality, water is the universal solvent. It is the baseline requirement for carbon-based life.
Right, we need it to survive.
It sustains, it nourishes, and fundamentally it reflects. It bounces photons back to our eyes, reflecting the sky, the moon, the world around it.
But this black water completely violates those laws of optics. When the villagers shine whatever meager light they can muster onto the surface, it does not reflect the night sky.
It shows something else.
Right. Instead, the surface acts like a window into a different dimension. They see a drowned world submerged deep beneath the water, filled with dark, non-Euclidean buildings and massive, shadowy figures moving far below.
It is the ultimate subversion of nature. The entity has corrupted the visual language of safety. When we look at a body of water, our brains expect to see a reflection of our own reality.
A mirror.
Yeah. By projecting a parallel hostile ecosystem through the surface tension, the entity is signaling that our reality is no longer the dominant physics engine in that space. The well has become a puncture wound in the fabric of their dimension.
And what they see standing inside that window is where the concept of bodily autonomy completely falls apart.
Ravi.
Yeah. Standing waist-deep in this impossible black water is Ravi, or at least his body. His father screams and lunges forward to pull him out, but an elder drags him back. Because Ravi isn't blinking.
He's gone.
And his eyes are gone. There are just empty black holes staring straight upward. And slowly, his face stretches into a smile that the text describes as too wide, too deep.
This is a critical transition point in the horror.
Yeah.
Ravi is no longer a biological human being. He has been reduced to a marionette.
Yeah.
The loss of autonomy is absolute. The narrative notes a crucial detail here. Dozens of pale, bloated human hands appear just beneath the surface of the black water, gripping Ravi's legs and torso tightly.
Ugh, that's so disturbing.
He isn't standing on a bottom, and he isn't treading water. He's being forcefully held upright by the collective mass of previous victims. The assimilation is complete. He is merely the fleshy lure dangling at the end of the line.
And I want to compare that visceral loss of control to the protagonist in our second source, the city narrative. Because in the city, the protagonist doesn't fall into a well, but they experience the exact same theft of autonomy.
Right, the paralysis.
They are standing in the middle of a frozen crowd, their mind racing with panic, but an unseen force begins to physically compel their body to turn around. They can't stop their own muscles from moving.
Exactly. In both scenarios, the predator demonstrates its power by hijacking the human nervous system.
Yeah.
Whether it's dead hands holding a boy upright in a flooded well, or an invisible pressure forcing a city dweller to turn and face a cosmic horror, the terrifying through line is that you are trapped inside a body that no longer takes orders from your brain.
It's like you're a passenger in your own skin.
Yes. Your physical form has been requisitioned by the environment.
Imagine standing at the edge of that well. Think about how fundamentally reality has broken for these people. You trust your own eyes, you trust the concept of water, you trust the face of your own child. And in a matter of seconds, all three of those foundational truths are violently weaponized against you.
And it doesn't stop there.
No, the weaponization doesn't stop at the visual. It immediately attacks the auditory senses again.
The hypnosis mechanic.
Yes. The black water starts to churn, and thousands of voices begin to whisper from it. The voices of dead villagers, missing children, generations of people taken by the well over centuries.
The chorus.
And they all whisper in unison, "It's hungry again." But then the acoustic targeting becomes incredibly precise. The mass of voices stops, and a single voice speaks directly to Ravi's father.
The wife.
It's the voice of his dead wife. She simply says, "Come join us."
This is the entity executing a precision psychological strike. It bypasses the horrific visual of the eyeless son and targets a deeper, older grief.
Right?
It isolates the specific emotional vulnerability of the father, the unresolved trauma of losing his spouse, and uses it as an override code for his survival instinct.
And the override is absolute. The father, who seconds ago was fighting the elders to save his son, suddenly stops struggling. His face goes completely slack.
He's hypnotized.
Yeah, he enters a profound hypnotic state. Without a word, he walks calmly toward the edge of the stone and steps directly off the edge into the black water. He doesn't brace for impact, he just steps into the void.
In the moment his biology makes contact with the entity's dimension, the illusion of the peaceful reunion shatters. Hundreds of pale arms explode upward through the surface tension, wrapping around him and dragging him down into the drowned city below. The violence is sudden and overwhelming.
The villagers react purely on adrenaline, though. A few of them manage to grab his hands before he is completely submerged. It takes several grown men pulling with all their strength to tear him free from the water's grip.
They get him back.
They pull him out, and he collapses onto the stone. But the victory is hollow because the damage has already been done at a speed that defies human biology.
When they roll him over, what do they see?
His eyes are already gone. In the span of perhaps 3 seconds beneath the surface, his eyes have been surgically removed. Thick black blood is pouring from the empty sockets.
But the most terrifying part isn't the physical mutilation. It's his reaction. He isn't screaming in pain. He is laughing uncontrollably, a hysterical, breathless laugh, and he keeps whispering, "They can see through me now."
That is just chilling.
If we look at the biological implications of that phrase, "they can see through me now," we realize the entity doesn't just consume biomass. It consumes sensory data.
Right.
By taking his eyes and leaving him alive, the entity has hardwired his optic nerve into its own neural network. The victims literally become sensory organs for the predator below.
It's like a biological camera feed.
Precisely. The entity exists in a dimension of darkness, largely blind to our surface world, until it harvests our sensory organs to use as its own.
So the laughter.
The father's hysterical laughter is the sound of a human mind shattering under the weight of being forcefully networked into a massive alien consciousness. His free will has been erased, replaced by the data-gathering imperative of the predator.
And now that the entity has a fresh set of eyes on the surface, it can see the entire village clearly. It sees the panic, it sees the potential energy of hundreds of living humans.
And it decides it wants them all.
Yeah, it decides that the localized trap is no longer sufficient. It wants the entire ecosystem. This is the exact turning point where the environment fully sheds the disguise of a static location and becomes a mobile, aggressive predator.
Up until this moment, if you stayed away from the well, you were theoretically safe.
Right.
The threat was physically anchored. But now, the physics of the water fundamentally alter.
The source text describes the black water beginning to rise, but it explicitly points out a horrifying physical detail. The water doesn't spill over the lip of the well, it climbs.
It crawls.
Yeah, the surface tension warps, and the black water crawls upward from the stone walls like thick, living fingers. It begins to flood the village streets, but it moves with complete silence.
We have to contrast this with natural disasters.
Right.
A normal flood is governed entirely by gravity and fluid dynamics.
As the water goes down.
It seeks the path of least resistance, rushing to the lowest topographical point, is loud, chaotic, and blind. But this black water defies gravity. It acts with deliberate, locomotive motive.
It has agency.
Yes. The water is no longer a byproduct of a deep aquifer. The water is the physical extension of the entity's cytoplasm.
I picture it exactly like a massive predatory slime mold.
Oh, that's perfect.
You know how biologists map the intelligence of a slime mold by putting oat flakes in a petri dish shaped like the Tokyo subway system? And the single-celled organism organically finds the most efficient routes to the food.
Yes.
This black water is an interdimensional slime mold, and the village is the petri dish. It's an ooze that thinks. It doesn't crash like a wave. It maps the territory, seeking out the biological signatures of the villagers.
And as it maps the territory, it begins to assimilate the architecture itself.
Oh, the houses.
The narrative provides a deeply unsettling detail as the water spreads through the dirt streets. The villagers lock themselves inside their homes, hoping the walls will hold back the flood. But then, every house in the village starts knocking.
But the knocking isn't coming from outside the doors. The text specifies the knocking is coming from inside the walls of the houses. And it's the exact same acoustic rhythm. 3 slow knocks, over and over, from inside the timber and plaster.
Consider how thoroughly that violates the human concept of shelter.
It ruins it completely.
From the time we lived in caves, our primary defense against predators has been putting a solid barrier between us and the outside world. The entity understands this psychological reliance on domestic spaces.
Right.
So by infecting the architecture, by making the walls themselves resonate with its presence, it is communicating that the concept of a safe space no longer exists.
You are not safe anywhere.
The membranes of their homes have become extensions of the entity's biology. The shelter has become the stomach.
Which forces them out into the open. If your house is knocking at you from the inside, you run. But how do you escape an environmental predator?
You can't.
If there's a flood, you run for high ground. But the black water isn't following topography, it's following sound. The text describes the villagers running with their lanterns and their children, trying to stay quiet, but the water turns corners. It splits off at intersections to cut them off. It is hunting them acoustically.
It is a dynamic pursuit. And as they flee toward the edge of the village, they encounter the next phase of the trap. Spatial distortion.
Yes.
The environment physically prevents their exit.
Right. They reach the edge of the forest that surrounds the village, the path that leads to the outside world. But the forest has fundamentally changed.
The trees.
The trees are standing far too close together. The gaps between the trunks are just gone, forming an impenetrable, twisting wooden wall that blocks every path outward. Reality itself is warping to keep the prey contained.
In terms of biological predation, the forest is functioning like the sphincter of a digestive tract.
Oh, gross, but accurate.
It has closed off the exit, ensuring the biological matter cannot escape the digestion process that is sweeping through the village. But the entity doesn't just rely on physical barriers. It continues the psychological tenderizing.
And this is where the imagery gets incredibly macabre. Hanging from the low branches of these impossibly dense trees are clothes.
Wet clothes.
Hundreds of wet, rotting garments dripping with black water, and the villagers immediately recognize them. They are the dresses, the shirts, the coats of every person who has gone missing in the well over the last century.
Why do you think the entity displays the clothing?
I mean, my instinct is just pure sadistic cruelty. It wants them to know there is no hope. But from an apex predator perspective, why expend the energy to decorate the forest with wet laundry? Why not just flood the woods and drown them all immediately?
Well, cruelty implies an emotional motivation, which is too human a concept for a cosmic entity. We must look at it functionally. The entity feeds on emotional resonance, specifically despair, grief, and terror. When a human experiences sudden, overwhelming psychological trauma, our endocrine system floods the body with cortisol and adrenaline.
A chemical spike.
Yes. It is highly possible that this biochemical spike is exactly what the entity requires to metabolize human consciousness.
Oh, wow.
By displaying the trophies of past hunts, it induces mass psychological paralysis. It is breaking their minds to weaken their physical resistance.
It's marinating them in their own terror.
Exactly.
And the ultimate example of this psychological marinade happens at the village school. The fleeing crowd hears a sound near the schoolhouse, a building that should be the heart of the community's future.
Right.
They run toward it, only to find the entire building flooded with black water halfway up the windows. Desks and chairs are floating silently, but beneath the surface of the water, filling the classrooms, are children.
And again, we must note their physical state. They are not drowning.
No. They're standing perfectly motionless, their feet on the floorboards, staring up through the black water. Dozens of pale children with empty eye sockets.
Just waiting.
And as the villagers hold their lanterns up to the glass, all the children beneath the water smile in perfect unison. One of the mothers in the crowd collapses, screaming because she recognizes her daughter who vanished 12 years prior.
The horror of that moment.
And then the drowned child slowly lifts her arm, her movements sluggish against the water, and points a pale finger back toward the center of the village, back toward the well.
Symbolically and functionally, the targeting of the school is devastating. Schools represent future potential. They are the incubation chambers for the next generation.
Yeah.
Seeing these stolen children preserved as biological puppets beneath the water perfectly encapsulates the entity's total consumption of the village's timeline.
It's taking everything.
It has taken their past, represented by the clothes of the elders in the trees, and it has consumed their future. The child pointing back to the well is a directive. The entity is using the face of innocence to deliver a command. Your timeline ends here. Return to the source.
It is entirely suffocating. You can't run to the woods, you can't hide in your house, and your children are waiting for you in the floodwater. And this brings us to the climax of the entity's attack strategy, which is the mass paralysis and the complete override of free will.
The bell.
Yes. Up until this moment at the school, the villagers were still fighting. They were running, screaming, crying. They were exerting kinetic energy. But then a sound cuts through the entire valley. The church bell rings.
A single massive toll, loud enough to rattle the glass in the lanterns.
But the narrative establishes that everyone is accounted for. There is absolutely no one inside the church tower. It rings a second time. But this time, it is accompanied by voices. As the bell chimes, thousands of drowned voices begin to sing from beneath the black floodwater that now covers the streets.
The quiet.
The villagers fall to their knees, covering their ears, because the singing doesn't sound human. The cadences are wrong. The text describes the words as ancient, sounding like a language that has been submerged underwater for millennia, bubbling up through silt and pressure.
We see the entity once again perverting a symbol of sanctuary. A church bell traditionally organizes a community. It calls them to safety, to worship, to unity.
A rallying point.
Right. Here, the entity uses the bell as an acoustic carrier wave for its own frequency. The combination of the bell's resonance and the submerged choir creates a neuroacoustic trigger.
And the effect is instantaneous. The moment that ancient singing synchronizes with the bell, every single person standing on the floodwater simply freezes. The panic evaporates. The kinetic energy drops to zero.
Total stillness.
We are back to the exact scenario from our second source, the Frozen City.
This is where the two narratives perfectly align. In the city, the protagonist watches as a bustling metropolis halts mid-step. Thousands of people trapped in their own bodies. In the village, the frantic flight for survival is overridden by a single auditory command. The environment asserts absolute control over the motor cortex of every living human in the vicinity.
The narrator watches their uncle, who a moment ago was desperately pulling people away from the school, suddenly stand up straight in the ankle-deep water. All the fear drains from his face. His expression becomes profoundly calm, almost peaceful.
The shift.
He looks down into the black water, reflecting the drowned city, and whispers softly, "They found the bottom."
That phrase, "they found the bottom," is one of the most chilling lines in the text, because it confirms the shift in consciousness.
What do you mean?
The uncle is no longer the author of his own thoughts. His individual ego has been suppressed or entirely overwritten. He's speaking on behalf of the collective entity. Their guy refers to the invasion force moving beneath the surface.
And what he does next confirms that the trap has fully closed. Before anyone can break the paralysis to stop him, the uncle just walks calmly toward the center of the flooded street. The black water suddenly churns, opening like a massive liquid mouth beneath him. A colossal shape shifts under the surface, and he simply vanishes, dragged down into the dark. But as he falls, his voice finally breaks the calmness. He screams.
Right.
But the text notes that his scream doesn't sound like it's coming from the street. It echoes upward from miles below the earth, fading into an impossible depth.
The contrast between his peaceful demeanor before the fall and the echoing scream after is vital.
Yeah.
It implies that the entity forces the body into compliance, creating a placid exterior, but the consciousness of the victim remains awake and trapped inside, fully aware as it is dragged into the abyss.
That's horrifying.
It is the ultimate violation. The predator didn't just overpower him physically, it assimilated his will, walked his body into the slaughterhouse, and left his mind trapped in the passenger seat to experience the descent.
So we have to ask, what does all of this mean for the nature of the entity?
It means that caloric intake, the consumption of meat and bone, is entirely secondary. This is an organism that consumes experience. It consumes consciousness.
Wow.
It wants to add their minds, their memories, and their voices to its submerged choir. It is a hive intelligence building a library of human suffering. When you are taken, you do not just die. You become an immortal, agonizing cell in a massive, ancient biological structure.
And once that mass assimilation begins, the entity drops all pretense of being a localized phenomenon. It reveals its true scale.
A final stage.
With the villagers paralyzed by the singing, the structural integrity of reality in the village finally gives way. All the old, dry wells scattered across the village properties explode open simultaneously.
Geysers everywhere.
Geysers of black water erupt into the night, flooding the houses, the roads, the people. And as the water level rises, the reflections in the water clarify. It's not just a few shadows moving down there anymore. The villagers, frozen in place, look down to see thousands of gigantic, pale shapes moving beneath an endless drowned ocean that sits just underneath the crust of their world.
The narrative formally shifts here from a localized supernatural horror to profound cosmic horror.
Yeah, it gets huge.
The entity is peeling back the skin of the earth to reveal that our surface world is incredibly fragile.
No.
It is nothing more than a thin ceiling sitting on top of its true oceanic domain.
And then the text delivers a detail that genuinely made my blood run cold. Up on a wooden pole near the center of the village, The old emergency loudspeaker system suddenly activates.
The broadcast.
It crackles with thick, heavy static, and then a wet, echoing voice speaks calmly over the speakers, blanketing the entire flooded valley. It says, "Surface contact successful."
Let's dissect the vocabulary of that broadcast. What strikes you about that specific phrase?
Well, it sounds distinctly military. It sounds like a status report from an expeditionary force.
Yeah.
Surface contact successful.
Right.
It completely reframes everything we've analyzed over the last hour. This isn't a mindless, instinctual beast feeding in the dark. This isn't a natural disaster of supernatural origin. This implies a highly systematic, calculated invasion from a parallel dimension. It implies a command structure, an objective, and an intelligence that understands human communications technology well enough to hijack it to announce its victory.
Exactly. It forces us to reevaluate the entire history of the well. The well was never just a hazard.
It was scout.
It was a scouting post, a keyhole bored through the dimensional barrier to test the resistance of the surface world. And now, thanks to a father's grief breaking the final seal, the door has been kicked wide open.
Yeah.
The entity has fully integrated human tools into its invasion strategy, proving its cognitive superiority.
And the immediate aftermath of that announcement proves the scale of the victory. The moment the voice stops, every dog in the village begins to howl in absolute terror. But the howling is cut short instantly.
Silence again.
Complete silence falls over the valley, the wind stops, the insects go quiet. The only sound left is the slow, wet splashing of footsteps approaching from the direction of the original well.
Someone's walking.
A figure emerges from the darkness, walking on top of the black floodwater. It's tall, far too thin, and endlessly dripping. At first, through the gloom, the paralyzed narrator thinks it's Ravi. But then, more figures step out of the dark behind him. Dozens. Hundreds.
The vanguard of the submerged city. The physical manifestation of the stolen community.
It's every single missing villager from the last century. Every person the well has ever taken. They walk silently over the surface of the water, an army of pale, bloated bodies with empty eye sockets, all wearing that identical, unnatural smile.
The puppets.
They are the puppet army, marching methodically through the paralyzed streets to physically claim the rest of the livestock that the acoustic trap has frozen in place.
And as the puppet army marches, the physical architecture of the portal undergoes its final transformation.
Yeah, behind the marching dead, the stone structure of the original well begins to violently expand. The heavy stones crack and shatter, the iron chains that the father broke snap into pieces.
Tearing open.
The circular mouth of the well stretches wider and wider, defying all principles of mass and physics. The text describes it as reality itself tearing open like a wet paper bag.
Such a great description.
The earth gives way, and beneath the widening chasm there is no bottom. There is only an endless darkness filled with thousands of massive moving eyes. And the army of drowned people suddenly speak together, their voices perfectly synchronized. They say, "It waited beneath your reflections."
The geometry of the space has collapsed. The physical boundaries of our three-dimensional world have yielded entirely to the architecture of the mirrored dimension.
Right.
The trap hasn't just caught the prey, the trap has consumed the room the prey was standing in.
And then the black floodwater surges upward, rising high enough to swallow the entire village in seconds. The houses disappear beneath the surface, the church tower drowns, the dense forest vanishes under the black tide.
It's all gone.
And standing miles above the new surface of this endless dark ocean, the colossal entity that has been orchestrating this entire nightmare finally reveals a fraction of itself. A mountain-sized face slowly emerges from the black water below reality.
And its skin.
The texture of its skin is entirely composed of fused, writhing, drowned human bodies.
This is the visual zenith of cosmic horror. We have tracked the progression from a small, creepy hole in the ground to a flooded street, and finally to an entity the size of a tectonic plate.
It's massive.
The realization forced upon the listener and the narrator is one of absolute insignificance. To this organism, human beings aren't adversaries. We aren't even prey in the traditional sense.
What are we?
We are just raw cellular material waiting to be harvested and woven into its skin.
The mountain-sized face shifts. Millions of eyes, stolen from generations of victims, open simultaneously across the dark expanse, looking upon the surface world for the very first time. The titanic amalgamation of bodies stretches into a horrific smile.
And they speak.
And as the village is dragged down into the dark, every single drop of water spanning the flooded valley whispers softly in a deafening chorus, We are finally overflowing.
The horrific poetry of that final phrase cannot be overstated. We are finally overflowing. It means the containment vessel of their alternate dimension has reached absolute capacity.
It's full.
Yes, it has consumed enough grief, enough biomass, and enough consciousness to permanently breach the surface tension of our reality. The ecosystem has officially flipped.
The invasion is over.
The surface world we know is gone. Our reality is now simply the bottom of its well.
Wow. Let's just take a breath and look back at the immense journey we've just taken through these sources. Because the narrative structure of this material is an absolute masterclass in escalating dread.
Oh, absolutely.
It doesn't rely on jump scares. It starts with a spooky, localized legend, right? A dry well you shouldn't approach at night. Then it systematically turns into a targeted emotional trap, weaponizing a father's grief to break a physical seal.
Right, the psychological hook.
From there, it escalates into an environmental flood, corrupting the geometry of safe spaces and using the acoustic rhythm of human fear against itself. And it finally culminates in a reality-breaking cosmic assimilation.
It proves that the ultimate horror isn't the cessation of life. It's the permanent, agonizing loss of free will, as your consciousness is forcefully integrated into the biology of a mountain-sized predator.
And by comparing the flooded village to the paralysis of the frozen city, we see the universal mechanics of how macro-predators operate.
Yes, the isolation and the paralysis.
They understand that human fragility exists in the things we trust the most implicitly. We trust the physical properties of water, we trust the sound of our loved ones' voices, we trust the solidarity of a crowd, and we trust the ground beneath our feet.
And these narratives systematically dismantle those trusts,
Yeah.
demonstrating perfectly that an apex predator of sufficient scale wouldn't need fangs, or claws, or speed.
Right.
It would simply need to manipulate our emotions to make us open the door and then control the environment to ensure we could never walk back out.
It fundamentally forces you to rethink the entire concept of a trap. We are so conditioned to look out for the steel jaw waiting in the woods or the tripwire strung across the path. But what do you do when the trap is the woods itself?
Right, what do you do?
What do you do when the trap is your own memory of your child calling you home in the dark?
It's a terrifying paradigm. And on that note, as we draw this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you, our listener, with a lingering thought to mull over.
Okay, let's hear it.
We move through our world surrounded by reflective surfaces. We walk past glass buildings. We stand over puddles in the street after a rainstorm. We stare into our bathroom mirrors every single morning.
Yeah.
The next time you look into a body of water or lock eyes with your own reflection in a dark window, take a moment to ask yourself a question. Are you absolutely certain you are just seeing light bouncing off a surface in your own world?
Oh, man.
Or is it possible you are looking at the thin surface tension of a window and simply hoping that whatever is washing you from the other side doesn't decide it's finally time to knock back?
3 slow knocks. Boom, boom, boom. I can honestly say I don't think I will ever look at a deep body of water or an empty street the exact same way again.
Me neither.
Thank you so much for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive. We hope you found the exploration of these predatory environments as intensely fascinating and deeply terrifying as we did. Stay curious, trust your instincts, and maybe give that old wishing well in the woods a very wide berth. We will catch you on the next deep dive.